You're probably wondering what the point of the previous sections were. Well, for almost a half a century, I have been studying and thinking about the relationship between multinational corporations, the intelligence community, particularly the CIA, organized crime, and law enforcement. And through my career, I've represented CIA agents, CIA assassins, mafia agents, mafia assassins, corrupt business people. In fact, when I started doing securities work a few years ago, I quipped on a radio interview that I'd never met a real criminal, having done criminal defense for almost 30 years. I never met a real criminal until I started representing people in the securities industries like stockbrokers. Not only were they just criminal, but they were also fairly decent sociopaths. So I remember when the Nixon scandal broke out about the Mary Carter paints and Roselli and Giancana and all of this kind of stuff. I remember before that there was the Billy Saul Estes scandal in the Johnson administration, where Billy Saul, one of Johnson's buddies, was pouring water in cooking oil barrels, storage containers, and then putting a foot or two on top of the oil so that when they put the dipstick in, it would come out as oil. But the majority of it was water. Therefore, he could pad his inventory. Other examples during that time was a company in Boulder, a computer manufacturer sent out bricks in their boxes in order to buy time. Things such as this. I remember under Nixon, the Spiro Agnew scandal, where Spiro was forced to resign as vice president of the United States because he was caught with his hands in the cookie jar taking bribes. So what's going on now is really new. What's going on more particularly is that it seems to have no boundaries. I think there were some boundaries that were sort of set either by convention or norms or whatever, and as long as there was just a little bit of pilfering going on or a little bit of corruption or whatever, as long as the government worked, it was fine. But now we've got massive, gross corruption, mismanagement, theft, embezzlement, the selling of governmental services without limits, without bounds. And the way the government's being operated now is like a mafia bust-out scheme or mafia bankruptcy fraud. And I'm really concerned about it because one of the principles of self-regulation is that you depend on the industry itself to sort of concoct its own norms and play by their own norms with normative behavior. So there's certain normative behavior in the stock market, and certain things are allowed or not made a big deal out of. In fact, with the stocks, they have a meeting in Denver every year where the SEC tells everybody what they're going to investigate that year. So if it's financial planners, they'll have seminars on financial planners and say they're going after financial planners. This is pretty much the enforcement technique of the large bureaucracies. It's a scare technique. I first ran into it in the 50s. One of the guys I practiced law with, father was a federal judge. He was also a lieutenant governor, the guy I practiced with. and we got his father's stuff, and we're sorting through it. And one of the things I ran across was something printed under the Eisenhower years called the IRS Intelligence Manual. And they published the statistics on every judge in the country and what their policies were on IRS crimes and tax crimes, things such as this. And talking to several agencies or agents, particularly when I had my run-in with the IRS, the CIA had asked them to kind of lean on me, and they put me out of business for a while. Anyway, they told me their whole theory of enforcement was to expect not to enforce the law of the IRS, the tax laws for everybody, but to make an occasional example out of people and scare the hell out of the rest of the country so that they wouldn't violate tax laws. Well, they got this down to a science, because what they would do was, instead of picking on wealthy people that could afford a battalion of lawyers, they would get us marginal people barely eking out a living and hit us with a hammer. And if nothing else, they would occupy where you had to cut down on the amount of work. For instance, with me, they cut me down to a 4-day work week by being in my office every Friday for 87 consecutive weeks. And then they put on penalties and interest and stuff like that. And the main thing they objected to is I didn't keep beginning and ending odometer readings when I went to court in various cities in Colorado. Of course, they could check the dockets, and I was there. And I told them that I wasn't the flying nun. I didn't fly to Pueblo or Colorado Springs, Trinidad, Fort Collins, Greeley, etc. And I knew how many miles it was, so when I come home, I'd put it in my appointment book. Well, that didn't comply with the regulations. Well, it was bullshit. But I just run for election and lost. I was in debt for my campaign. And I went from a 5-man law office then to a 1-man law office. So essentially by circumstances in the 70s, I was forced into investigating all this shit for survival. And I'd talked to Frationi, I'd talked to some of the other stuff. I met other people. I met CIA agents, mafioso in Las Vegas. One of my clients has a copy of a photograph taken in the Tropicana with some high-level politicians and Carlos Leder, one of the cartel members. When I worked with Dan Sheehan, he used my office when he was suing the CIA individually on the Pinta bombing case, took many depositions in my office, and we used to discuss things such as that, and we were tracking the mafia CIA drug connection. And because of my arrangements when I first started representing them, I was in a good position to know and understand and observe some of this. And like I promised, I'm trying to tell the truth here, as unbelievable as that might sound. But like I'm saying, the present administration didn't recognize any acceptable parameters. His campaign speech was he was going to drain the swamp. Well, he didn't drain the damn swamp. He filled it with alligators. And these alligators going to get you. And one of the other things I did, occasionally I would go back to the university and take graduate courses. And one of the things I studied was postmodern social theory, and particularly interested in the German theory, Habermas, etc., which was the study of propaganda and the study of how Hitler rose to power using propaganda and mythology as a means to get there. And I studied it more intensely when I was at the Nuremberg Museum in the courthouse there. And the thing that most people forget is how did this little twerp colonel get to the point of being the ruler of a fairly large empire or Reich, the Third Reich. And he was funded by industrialists because he set up these camps as free labor camps, kind of like our prisons today, working with various corporations. But it takes a lot of money to set things like this up. Look at some of the things going on in Libya, Syria, Lebanon, things like that. Where the hell do these people get these anti-tank devices, these missiles, all this heavy weaponry? It costs money. They don't take it out of their piggy banks. They don't take it out of their monthly or weekly salaries. That's big money. Somebody has to be putting it up. And that money comes from the drug industry. The drug industry for years has been funding revolutionary activities and regime changes sponsored by the Central Intelligence Agency. And it makes sense if you stop to think about it. And it's not new. This has been going on for quite a while. But it's gone on to the point where it's out of control. And I'm fearful that what happened in Germany in the 30s could happen here, because there aren't any limits. There aren't any parameters. All of our mores and folkways, laws even, are being ignored or twisted or manipulated, or as what's happening now, the courts are being stacked against the individuals for the corporations under the guise of originalism, which is absolute bullshit. If you look at the society when the Magna Carta and the Constitution was drafted, there weren't any corporations. So how can favoring corporations be original? Anyway, I digress from that. What I want to do is point out the thing with the football game, because it's a lot of money. $1.5 billion is a lot of money, more than I could probably spend in my lifetime. But you got to look at who benefits, where does this money come from, where does it go, etc. Well, a lot of it goes to support revenue in the advertising agencies from football advertising. I mean, I remember early they had the Hamm's Blue Ribbon beer commercials, Gillette commercials, things like that. Over the last 50 years, they got a lot more sophisticated than those old ones. But the revenues are also really, really up there. And professional sports is a good medium in which to sell advertising. And they didn't want my client defending the case because he knew too much. He knew what the code was that they were using over the phone. He knew that the big players, the oil players, were figuring out what the syndicate was doing and screwing up their little racket. And that's why they got prosecuted. They weren't exactly racketeers. They were like the one book title said, tin horn gamblers. And like the one with Pody Poe said, they spent $13 million making him into a racketeer from a tin horn gambler. Well, that's peanuts compared to $1.5 billion. But they made him a racketeer so they could prosecute him and show that they were doing their job against the gamblers and mafia people and things like this, when in fact all they were trying to do is protect their little racket so that it didn't go the way of professional football. If you remember, professional football almost died when it was exposed to be nothing but theater and staged and things like this. Well, professional sports is almost to that point, only it's not blatant, and they only do it once in a while. And they only do it in order to throw a little money into the fund and cover the losses so nobody gets hurt that much, at least in the industry and the bookmaker and the gamblers. So that's why I did this. It was a long time ago that I did that case. And I did several racketeering cases in my career. And it was kind of a heady experience. A bunch of guys that I knew from all over the country that were famous, semi-famous, etc. would fly in on one of these cases, and the top of the Justice Department would come in, and we generally duke it out. There wasn't any deals made. It was pure law, and it was enjoyable, it was fun, and it was interesting. And it also teaches people a lot. My old partner now is doing national security cases, and they're playing games among that. The ones I did, I used to blackmail the intelligence community, and they let them go. Well, the guy we used to practice with is kind of doing it on the straightway, and they're playing games like saying they can't find a safe house for him and things like this. And that's the next battleground, because it's kangaroo court area. Look what they're doing to Julian Assange. He exposed war crimes by people and our soldiers and private contractors in Libya and places like that. And instead of giving him a medal for exposing the misconduct, they're indicting him and trying to extradite him to the United States to lock him up forever so that we don't get these kind of leaks. Imagine what would happen during the Vietnam era if they'd have gone after Ellsberg the same way as they did Assange. We'd probably still be in Vietnam today. I think it's the patriotic duty of Americans to point out what criminal actions our government is engaged in and expose them so that we can make a better country for the benefit of the citizenry and not the greedy bastards that are running things. So much for my sermon today. I hope you give me as much feedback as you can, because I need it in order to keep this shit up. So take it easy and be good, and try not to catch coronavirus.